October 2021. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the towering pines surrounding the entrance of the old Crescent Mine, about 20 miles outside Silver Creek, California. Sheriff's Deputy Jake Sorensen's boots crunched on dry pine needles as he cautiously approached the rusted chain-link fence. Teenagers from town had been posting TikTok videos of their adventures in the abandoned mine, daring each other to go deeper each time. What began as a routine trespassing call was about to become something else entirely. Sorensen's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness inside the mine's gaping entrance. Stale, cool air clung to the tunnel walls. A few graffiti tags and discarded soda cans marked where local kids usually stopped. Today, something felt different. About 100 yards in, Sorensen noticed a section of the tunnel wall that didn't look right. A mound of rocks and timber that appeared deliberately stacked, not a natural cave-in. He radioed for backup, voice echoing in the depths. "Dispatch, I need assistance at the old Crescent Mine, and notify the coroner." Heart pounding, Sorensen carefully removed one loose timber and a few rocks, revealing a narrow alcove behind the makeshift barrier. His blood ran cold. There, in the flicker of his flashlight, lay the skeletal remains of two human bodies, side by side on the rocky ground. Tattered shreds of blue cloth clung to the bones, what looked like the uniforms from a long-closed local diner. And just visible in the dirt near a bony hand was a small silver locket, tarnished with age, its face engraved with two initials, AP. Sorensen gently picked it up, recognizing it immediately. Locals still whispered about a necklace just like this, the one Amy Parker was wearing the night she vanished, along with her identical twin sister Allison back in 1996. For 25 years, the fate of the Parker twins had been nothing but painful questions and empty answers in Silver Creek. Two vibrant young women had simply disappeared one autumn evening after their shifts at the local diner. Two empty chairs at Thanksgiving and Christmas year after year, in a family that never stopped searching. Now, at long last, it looked like Silver Creek's most haunting mystery was about to be solved. Before we continue this shocking story, take a moment to hit subscribe and like this video. Cold Case Desk is dedicated to bringing these forgotten stories to light, and your support ensures that the truth will surface and future investigations aren't missed by the algorithm. The discovery at Crescent Mine wasn't just the closing chapter of a missing persons case, it was the first domino in a chain of events that would expose secrets long buried in Silver Creek. When authorities finally identified a suspect and made an arrest in late 2021, it wasn't some vagrant or unknown predator. It was someone the community had known and trusted, someone who had walked freely among them for 25 years, all while carrying the weight of an unspeakable truth. The Parker case represents more than just a solved mystery. It stands as a testament to the unyielding persistence of a family that never stopped searching, to investigators who refused to let the case files gather dust, and to advances in forensic science that ultimately gave a voice to victims long silenced. It's also a cautionary tale about a community divided. When the twins disappeared in 1996, fear and suspicion tore through Summit County like a brush fire. Neighbors eyed each other warily, old grudges were dragged into the light. The desperate hunt for the Parker sisters exposed fault lines beneath the surface of this small town, lines that would crack wide open when the truth finally emerged a quarter-century later. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. It's always astounding to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us across distances. Tonight, we'll walk through the events of October 1996, trace the decades-long search for answers, and reveal the stunning breakthrough that finally brought closure to one of California's most baffling cold cases. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and ultimately justice delayed but not denied. Summit County, California in 1996 was the kind of place where everyone truly thought they knew everyone, and for the most part, they did. Just over 20,000 residents were scattered among the pine-covered hills, old mining hamlets, and ranchlands. The county seat, Silver Creek, with its modest main street and single stoplight, served as the heart of local life and gossip. Change came slowly here. The population boom transforming much of California had largely bypassed Summit County, where many families had deep roots and newcomers were regarded with a hint of caution. The economic anxieties of the 1990s, factories closing, jobs moving overseas, felt distant, but not entirely. The local economy rested on logging, a bit of tourism, and the Summit Mining Company's gold quarry on the outskirts of town. Environmental regulations had begun to curtail the timber industry, but the mine still provided steady, if dangerous, work for dozens of families. Hal's Diner sat at the corner of Main and Cedar Streets in Silver Creek, its retro neon sign buzzing to life each evening. In 1996, Hal's was the unofficial community hub. At daybreak, farmers and ranchers nursed their coffees while swapping stories about the weather. Come afternoon, miners fresh off a shift and clerks from the feed supply ate side by side at the counter. On Friday nights, high school kids in Letterman jackets crowded the booths after football games, and third-shift workers grabbed late dinners before heading to overnight jobs. It was here, bussing tables and refilling cups of coffee, that 18-year-old twin sisters Amy and Allison Parker had found their place in the world. The Parker family wasn't originally from Silver Creek, and that made them stand out just a little. In 1988, Jack Parker moved his wife Linda and their 4 children from Nevada to this quiet corner of Northern California when he landed a supervisor job at Summit Mining. The chance for better pay and a safer community had been a godsend. By 1996, the Parkers were still considered newcomers by some old-timers' standards, but they had woven themselves into the fabric of the town. Jack was respected as a hard-working foreman known to put safety before profit. Linda volunteered at church bake sales and school events. Their 2 youngest children, David and Emily, were students at Silver Creek High, while the twins, Amy and Allison, had graduated with the class of '96 just a few months earlier. Identical twins, Amy and Allison, were impossible to miss in a small town of familiar faces. Both stood around 5'5", tall with long honey-brown hair and bright green eyes. Their smiles could light up a room, as many a customer at Hal's Diner would later recall. But those who knew the girls best could easily tell them apart. Amy, older than her sister by a mere 6 minutes, wore her hair parted on the left and carried herself with a quiet, steady confidence. She had a nurturing side and dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. She'd been saving every extra dollar in hopes of starting community college the next year. Allison, Allie to her friends, parted her hair on the right and had a more mischievous spark in her eyes. Outgoing and spontaneous, she loved music and sang in the church choir, strumming her beat-up acoustic guitar at weekend youth group gatherings. Allie talked about moving to Los Angeles someday to try her luck in the music scene or maybe even Hollywood. Those girls were joined at the hip, recalls Marjorie Keene, who managed Hal's Diner back in the 90s. They always worked the same shifts, rode to work together, sometimes even showed up in matching outfits. But personality-wise, they were different as night and day. Amy was the organized one, always on time, already planning her next move. Allie was a free spirit. She lived more in the moment and could charm just about anyone with that laugh of hers. Keene smiles sadly, remembering how the twins would playfully bicker over who got to serve their favorite regulars. They were a great team, and they had each other's backs, no matter what. October 4th, 1996, started out like any other autumn day in Silver Creek. The Parker twins came in for the afternoon shift at Hal's Diner around 3 p.m., donning matching powder blue uniforms with white aprons. The evening was brisk and clear, and the diner bustled with activity. A group of tourists in town for the start of hunting season filled one corner booth, and a few families grabbed dinner early before the Silver Creek High Bearcats played an away football game that night. A security camera in the diner, grainy but in color, captured glimpses of the sisters at work. Amy can be seen methodically topping off coffee mugs and clearing tables with her usual diligence. Allie, meanwhile, is often spotted at the counter, laughing with regulars and swapping jokes with a pair of off-duty cops enjoying their meal. By 9:15 p.m., the twins' shift was over. They clocked out, pocketed their tip money, and waved goodbye to the cook and the night manager as they headed out into the cool night. "Good night. See you tomorrow," Allie called brightly on her way through the door. the last words anyone at Hal's diner would ever hear from them. The plan was simple: walk home together, just as they'd done countless evenings before. The sisters' route home was a familiar 1-mile stroll. They headed down Main Street past darkened storefronts and the quiet post office, then turned onto River Road, which led east toward their neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Even at that hour, River Road was considered safe, well lit by street lamps and well-traveled, at least until about 10 p.m. The Parker twins had walked that path hundreds of times, often arm in arm, talking about everything and nothing under the moonlight. At some point along the way, they decided to make a quick stop. A little after 9:30 p.m., Amy and Allie stepped into Harper's Pharmacy on River Road, one of the few shops still open that late. Judith Harper, the pharmacist and owner, who had known the girls since they were teenagers buying soda and comic books, greeted them warmly. The twins were looking for a birthday card. Their younger sister Emily's 15th birthday was coming up the next week, and Amy wanted to surprise her with a card featuring kittens, Emily's favorite. They were in a great mood, Judith recalled, giggling over which silly card to get. Allie was teasing Amy, saying she was more nervous about Emily's birthday than Emily would be. The sisters eventually found a card with a cartoon cat and a punny birthday joke. They paid $2.19, thanked Judith, and walked back out into the night, heading east on River Road toward home at around 9:40 p.m. The walk from Harper's Pharmacy to the Parker house on Maple Lane was about 10 minutes. By 10:15 p.m., however, the twins still hadn't arrived. Inside the modest Parker home, Linda Parker felt a gnawing worry. She'd expected to hear the front door any minute after 10 o'clock. By 10:30, that worry had blossomed into panic. Linda called Hal's diner, her voice trembling, only to learn from the night manager that her daughters had left over an hour earlier. Jack Parker didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and hurried out into the night, driving slowly along the route the girls always walked, his headlights cutting through the dark. He strained to spot any sign of them, their silhouettes on the sidewalk, maybe Allie's favorite red jacket, but saw nothing except empty streets and swirling autumn leaves. He stopped at the pharmacy and pounded on the locked door until Judith let him in, only to confirm that the twins had left some time ago. With dread creeping into his chest, Jack returned home around midnight with no news. At 12:07 a.m. on October 5, 1996, the Parker family dialed the Summit County Sheriff's Department to report Amy and Allie missing. A patrol deputy arrived at the house within the hour. Initially, he tried to reassure the anxious parents. Two 18-year-old girls missing for just a few hours on a Friday night didn't immediately raise alarm bells. "They're probably out with friends or got sidetracked," the deputy suggested, advising Jack and Linda to get some rest and wait until morning. But Linda couldn't rest. She spent the night on the living room sofa, jumping at every car that passed, praying to hear the sound of her daughter's laughter pulling into the driveway. Morning came with no sign of Amy or Allie. Their beds were still neatly made from the day before. No late-night phone calls, no notes left behind. Nothing. By mid-morning on October 5th, the realization set in. The Parker twins had truly vanished into the darkness. Within hours of the twins' disappearance, the community mobilized in a way Silver Creek had never seen before. By the afternoon of October 5, 1996, the Parker home was filled with friends, neighbors, and church members offering support. Volunteers organized search parties that combed every street, alley, and patch of woods along the route Amy and Allie would have taken. Boy Scouts waded through the reeds by Miller's Creek, and volunteer firefighters poked through underbrush in nearby fields. Local radio stations interrupted their music programs with alerts about the missing sisters, and volunteers tacked up hundreds of flyers bearing the girls' senior portraits and descriptions. Sheriff's deputies, unused to major investigations, found themselves coordinating with state troopers and even a few FBI agents who arrived by the third day as the reality set in that this was likely an abduction. They set up a tip hotline and conducted a door-to-door canvass along River Road and the surrounding blocks. No detail was too small to chase down. Early on, searchers discovered a scrap of light blue fabric caught on a chain-link fence near an abandoned lot along River Road. For a brief moment, hope surged. Could it be from one of the girls' diner uniforms or aprons? But laboratory analysis a week later dashed those hopes. The cloth was a different material and color than the uniforms, likely just a bit of old clothing carried by the wind. It was a dead end, and one of many to come. Without a crime scene to examine, investigators focused on reconstructing the twins' last known movements and finding anyone who might have seen or heard something. Judith Harper, the pharmacist, was the last person confirmed to have spoken to the sisters. Her account helped establish the timeline that they left the pharmacy around 9:40 p.m. Several other locals reported potentially seeing the girls or something unusual that night, though memories were frustratingly foggy and sometimes conflicting. An elderly man taking out his trash on a side street off River Road thought he heard a brief scream or shout around 9:50 p.m., but he wasn't sure and hadn't investigated at the time. A teenage couple sitting on their porch 2 blocks from the Parker home reported seeing a rusty brown van with a busted taillight idling near an intersection around the same time. Over at the First Baptist Church, a night janitor on a smoke break recalled a similar van speeding west, away from town, shortly before 10 p.m. None of these sightings were certain to be connected, but taken together they painted a chilling possibility. The twins may have encountered a vehicle, and possibly an individual, along their route. One lead quickly took center stage. Based on witness descriptions, deputies were on the lookout for an older model brown or maroon van seen in the vicinity. Working from a partial license plate, witnesses agreed the plate included the numbers 3 and 8. The sheriff's department compiled a list of vans in the region fitting the description. Within a week, they identified a possible match, a 1984 Dodge van owned by Stan Peterson, a 38-year-old handyman who lived alone just outside Silver Creek. Peterson became the first major person of interest. When investigators questioned him on October 12th, he admitted he'd been driving through town the night of October 4th. He claimed his van had overheated, so he pulled over on River Road for a few minutes around 9:45 p.m. to let the engine cool. Peterson insisted he hadn't seen the Parker twins or anyone else on the road, and that he went straight home afterward. His wife, from whom he was separated but coincidentally visiting that week, supported parts of his story, saying Stan arrived at her house before 10:30 p.m. that night to sleep on the couch. With no evidence tying him directly to the crime, the van was old and messy, but police found no traces of blood or struggle in it. Authorities had little choice but to release Peterson. Still, sheriff's deputies kept a wary eye on him, and whispers around town quickly painted Stan Peterson as a potential villain. He would remain an unofficial suspect in many eyes for years, despite the lack of proof. As the investigation widened, other potential suspects emerged. Rumors flew, and nearly everyone who had any tangential connection to the twins came under scrutiny. One name on the early list was Mark Thompson, a 25-year-old second cousin of the Parkers who had visited from Idaho about a month before the girls disappeared. Family members recalled Mark paying a bit too much attention to Allie during his stay. He'd even asked her to go out for a drive, an offer she politely declined. Investigators learned that Mark had returned to Idaho shortly after his visit. When contacted, he claimed he was back at work on October 4th and had time cards and co-workers to back it up. Indeed, his employer produced records showing Mark clocked in for an overnight shift in Boise the night the twins vanished. Barring an elaborate conspiracy, he couldn't have been in Silver Creek that night. Some investigators would later question whether those time cards could have been falsified, but in 1996, Mark Thompson was dropped from the active suspect list due to a seemingly solid alibi. Another lead pointed to someone much closer to home, Richard Bowers, the 56-year-old owner of Summit Mining Company and Jack Parker's boss. Bowers was a prominent figure in the community. He donated to local charities and rubbed elbows with the county commissioners, but not everyone held him in high regard. In late September 1996, just weeks before the girls disappeared, Jack Parker had gotten into a heated argument with Bowers at a safety meeting, pushing for a temporary shutdown of part of the mine to address hazardous conditions. Bowers had vehemently opposed the idea, worried about lost revenue. Their shouting match in front of other employees became the talk of the town. When Amy and Allie went missing, some couldn't help but wonder if an enraged Bowers had retaliated in some unthinkable way against Jack by targeting his daughters. It was a wild theory, but in a vacuum of evidence, even wild theories gained traction. Bowers, for his part, cooperated fully with investigators. He was out of town on October 4th, attending a mining executive's dinner in Sacramento, a fact verified by multiple witnesses, receipts, and even a few photographs. There was no indication he had any involvement, and detectives could find nothing but small-town gossip linking him to the case. Reluctantly, the spotlight moved on. Next on the list was someone the twins knew well, Jason Bell, age 19, who had dated Ali Parker during their senior year until a messy breakup that spring. Jason had a bit of a reputation as a troublemaker, minor scuffles at school, a speeding ticket or two, and friends said he hadn't taken the breakup with Ali very well. Naturally, investigators had to consider him. Jason had no strong alibi for the night of October 4th. He told police he was at home watching TV alone. However, he seemed genuinely shocked and distraught about the girl's disappearance. He willingly answered every question thrown at him and even agreed to a polygraph test. The results indicated no deception on his part. Moreover, a search of Jason's car and belongings turned up no evidence. In a town as small as Silver Creek, many figured if Jason was involved, some friend or relative would have noticed something off about him, but nothing incriminating ever surfaced. He was eventually cleared by law enforcement, though Jason later admitted that some townsfolk continued to eye him with suspicion long afterward. By early November 1996, each promising lead had led investigators down a path that circled back to nowhere. The FBI agents, facing pressure from other cases, began to pack up their temporary command post at the Silver Creek Town Hall. Tips continued to trickle in. A driver passing through claimed to have seen taillights in the woods off a highway that night. A self-proclaimed psychic insisted the girl's spirits were reaching out, but nothing that led to concrete evidence. "It's like chasing ghosts," one frustrated deputy told a reporter off the record. The case that initially galvanized an entire community was hitting a wall. It might have maintained momentum a while longer, if not for a sudden jolt of chaos elsewhere. On December 5, 1996, a botched bank robbery in neighboring Jackson County turned into a bloody hostage situation that dominated regional headlines. 3 people were killed in the shootout, and the perpetrators escaped, triggering one of the largest manhunts in California that year. Overnight, nearly every state investigator and FBI field agent in Northern California was reassigned to track the fugitives. The Parker twins' disappearance, lacking fresh leads and now eclipsed by a high-profile violent crime, was quietly shunted aside. As the holiday season arrived, the volunteer search parties disbanded. The flyers with Amy and Ali's faces grew tattered on telephone poles and bulletin boards. Official press briefings about the case became infrequent and then stopped altogether. The file on the Parker case remained open, but it was now gathering dust in a cabinet at the sheriff's office, joining a handful of other unsolved cases that no one had the time or resources to pursue. For Silver Creek, the horror of what happened to the Parker twins cast a long shadow. In a matter of weeks, the town's sense of security had been upended. Families that once left doors unlocked at night now installed chain locks and double-checked them before bed. Children who used to roam freely until the 9 o'clock whistle now had strict curfews and escorts. Neighbors eyed each other with a touch of suspicion. After all, if whoever took the Parker girls was someone from town, how could you know whom to trust? As 1996 turned into 1997, the mystery of Amy and Ali Parker settled into an uneasy status, an unsolved tragedy that everyone remembered, but no one could solve. The twins' story became a cautionary tale whispered to restless children. Don't stay out too late, or you'll end up like those Parker girls. The pain and fear were still raw, but with no answers forthcoming, life in Summit County had to carry on under the weight of uncertainty and the lingering question, who could have done such a thing? What time is it where you're watching right now? Let me know in the comments below. Day or night, somewhere out there, a family is still hoping for answers in a case like this one, and as the long days and nights passed in Silver Creek, the Parkers remained stuck in that awful limbo, waiting for a miracle, or a confession, or even just a sign from their missing daughters. In the Parker household, time effectively stopped on October 4th, 1996. For years afterward, the calendar in the kitchen remained turned to that month, the date marked with a red circle, a quiet memorial to to the day two beloved daughters vanished. Life for the remaining family split into two halves, before that night and after. Jack Parker had always been a man of action and pragmatism. At 42, he was a compactly built fellow with sandy brown hair and work-toughened hands that bore the scars of years in mines and workshops. He prided himself on being a problem solver, the kind of man who fixed things around the house before anyone even noticed they were broken. But when Amy and Ali disappeared, Jack was confronted with a problem he couldn't easily solve, and it nearly broke him. 3 weeks after the twins went missing, Jack took a leave of absence from the mine that unofficially became a permanent retirement. With a modest payout from his accumulated vacation days and whatever savings the family had, he poured all his energy into his own investigation. The Parkers' two-car garage soon transformed into a makeshift command center for the search. Maps of Summit County and the greater Northern California region were tacked to every wall, prickling with colored pushpins. Red pins marked places volunteers had searched: the creek beds, abandoned cabins in the woods, old logging roads, highway rest stops for 50 miles in every direction. Blue pins indicated reported sightings of the girls, each one investigated by Jack himself, no matter how far-fetched. Yellow pins marked the homes of anyone who had been even remotely suspect in Jack's eyes at one time or another. Stacks of spiral notebooks filled with Jack's meticulous notes cluttered a folding table alongside a second-hand police scanner he had bought. In the corner sat a dedicated telephone, a plain black landline with a number Jack had printed on thousands of flyers and distributed across Alabama and neighboring states. It rang directly to the garage, ready to receive any tip, day or night. Jack's daily routine became relentless. At dawn, he'd lace up his boots and head out to search, often revisiting areas he feared might have been overlooked. One day he might be slogging through marshland by the highway, the next checking an overgrown mine shaft with a flashlight and rope. Afternoons were spent following up on tips, knocking on doors and interviewing anyone who might have known something. Even the remotest connection was pursued. He learned to interview people like a seasoned detective, keeping detailed records of what was said. In the evenings, he would return home, spread out maps on the dining room table, and methodically plan the next day's campaign. He allowed himself no more than 4 hours of sleep a night, catnapping on the living room recliner, always fully dressed in case the phone rang. Dad was like a man possessed, David Parker later reflected. He wouldn't rest, he wouldn't even eat properly unless we forced a sandwich into his hands. He just kept searching. The stress and exhaustion carved deep lines into Jack's face. Within a year, his hair had turned almost completely grey. By the early 2000s, he developed high blood pressure and a persistent chest pain that doctors warned was stress-related angina. Still, he refused to slow down. "Not until I find my girls," he would say. "Not until I bring them home." While Jack channeled his grief into tireless action, Linda Parker's world turned inward, defined by quiet sorrow and steadfast hope. A gentle woman who had devoted herself to her family, Linda was hit perhaps hardest of all by the loss of her eldest children. For months after the disappearance, she would wake up and, for a blissful split second, forget that anything was wrong. Then reality would crush her all over again. After October 1996, those who knew Linda described her as a ghost of the cheerful mother she once was. She attended Sunday church services with almost feverish devotion, clutching a photo of Amy and Ali in her prayer book. Every single evening, Linda performed a small ritual. At dusk, she would switch on the porch light and whisper a prayer that its beam might guide her girls home. That porch light stayed on all night, every night, for 25 years. She also kept the twins' bedroom exactly as it was the day they disappeared. On the nightstand, 2 alarm clocks remained set for 7 a.m., just as the girls had left them. Linda dusted that room every week, washed the sheets every month, and even left little seasonal decorations, pumpkins in the fall, tinsel at Christmas, as if preparing for her daughter's imminent return. She never uttered the word dead in connection with Amy and Ali. To her they were missing away elsewhere, but never truly gone. "A mother knows," she would say to anyone who dared question her optimism. "I would feel it here if they were." if they weren't alive anymore. And so she waited, a sentinel at the window, gazing out at the quiet street each evening, imagining two silhouettes coming up the drive. The Parker children who remained, David and Emily, found themselves forced to grow up faster than any child should. David was a high school junior when his sisters vanished. In the immediate aftermath, he reacted by withdrawing into himself. Once a chatty, outgoing kid, David became quiet and intensely focused on academics, using textbooks and baseball practice as an escape from the painful uncertainty at home. At school, he found it easier to slip into the background. Teachers gave him sympathetic leeway on assignments, and classmates, unsure what to say, mostly left him alone. After graduating in 1998, David left Summit County to attend college in Oregon. Getting out of the shadow of his sister's disappearance was, in a sense, an act of self-preservation. He loved his family, but the constant reminders, the flyers, the news clippings on the fridge, the empty chairs at dinner, were too much to bear. Over the years, David returned home less and less frequently. He built a life for himself, eventually landing a job as a software engineer in Seattle. Yet, every time the phone rang late at night, his heart would pound, dreading that it might be the call, the one with news. "I think he felt guilty," Emily said of her brother. Guilty that he got to move on and live his life when Amy and Ali couldn't. But he shouldn't have. None of us ever blamed him for leaving. Emily, the youngest, was only 14 when she lost her sisters, and effectively in many ways her parents as well. With Jack consumed by the search and Linda consumed by grief, Emily had to navigate adolescence largely on her own. At school, she endured the whispers and stares that came with being the missing girl's sister. Some peers tried to be supportive, but others were awkward or even cruel, spreading baseless rumors or theories about what really happened. Emily quickly learned to steel herself. She became fiercely protective of her family's privacy and legacy. Despite her own fear and heartbreak, Emily took on the role of her mother's caretaker, making sure Linda ate meals and helping maintain the house when Jack was away on searches. After high school, Emily chose to attend community college in Silver Creek, not because she lacked ambition, but because she couldn't stomach leaving her parents alone with their pain. She turned into an advocate as well, organizing the annual candlelight vigil in honor of Amy and Ali every October, speaking to the local newspaper and later on social media to keep the case in the public eye. For years, Emily was the one replenishing the fading missing posters around town and answering emails that trickled into the family's Find the Parker Twins website. "I wasn't going to let people forget," she explained. "That was my biggest fear, that everyone would just move on and my sisters would fade from memory." The extended Parker family did what they could to support Jack, Linda, and the kids. Relatives from Nevada and Idaho sent money to help with expenses after Jack quit his job. Linda's sister, Kathleen, relocated from Utah to live with the Parkers for nearly a year, helping to cook meals and care for Emily while Jack and Linda were in the deepest throes of their search and despair. In 1999, Jack's older brother, Ron Parker, moved his own family to Silver Creek, ostensibly for a job in nearby Redding, but really to be closer to his grieving brother. Ron quietly took over handling the Parkers' mortgage payments and maintenance of the house when Jack could not. "We all just tried to hold them together," Ron said. Jack would have searched until his last breath, and Linda would have waited just as long. Watching them go through that, it was like witnessing a candle that wouldn't go out, no matter how hard the storm blew. Despite the strain and the years of unresolved sorrow, the Parker family never completely fell apart. If anything, the ordeal forged an unspoken pact among them. They would not abandon hope, and they would not abandon each other. Each member, in their own way, kept the memory of Amy and Ali alive. Jack with his maps and phone calls, Linda with her nightly porch light, David with a faded photo of his twin sisters tucked in his wallet, and Emily with her public crusade to ensure the town of Silver Creek never forgot two of its own. If you're finding this story as heartbreaking as I do, please remember to hit subscribe. By supporting Cold Case Desk, you're helping us honor these families and ensure that victims like Amy and Ali are never forgotten. Cases like this show us the true cost of not knowing and why we must keep searching for the truth. The passage of time brought major changes to Summit County, but for the Parker case, the clock seemed frozen. In the years and decades after 1996, Silver Creek evolved from the quaint small town it had been. A new 4-lane bypass highway was constructed in the early 2000s, connecting the remote county more easily to Sacramento and beyond. With it came the creeping influence of the outside world. A Walmart opened outside Silver Creek in 2005, drawing shoppers away from the mom-and-pop stores around the Old Town Square. Hal's Diner, where Amy and Allie had spent so many hours, couldn't survive the changing economy. It shuttered its doors in 2004. The building cycled through identities, first a video rental shop, then a thrift store, and eventually a generic fast food franchise. Harper's Pharmacy, the last place the twins were seen alive, was sold to a national drugstore chain and lost its personal hometown feel. Even the Summit Mining Company, which had lured the Parkers to California, closed its operations in 2003 amid plummeting gold prices and rising environmental restrictions. The mine entrances were sealed and left to the encroaching forest. It seemed as if the very landscape of the community was trying to bury the past. Yet, with each demolition of an old building or paving of a new road, there was a nagging fear among those who remembered the case. Are we destroying a clue without even knowing it? Calvin Shaw, a retired deputy who had been part of the original search, once lamented, "Every time an old shed got torn down or a field got ploughed under for development, I'd wonder if we were paving over the girls' secrets." The physical reminders of October 1996 might have slowly vanished from Silver Creek, but the memory of the missing twins refused to fade. Every few years, as if on a somber timetable, the Parker case would resurface in the public consciousness. The local newspaper ran retrospective pieces on the 5th, 10th, and 20th anniversaries of the disappearance, stirring up dormant leads and fresh calls to action. Each time, a handful of new tips would trickle in, and investigators would dutifully chase them, hoping against hope that maybe this one would be the break they needed. In 2001, a newly elected sheriff, Mark Sandoval, made the Parker case a priority. Campaigning on a promise to bring closure to Summit County's most infamous cold case, Sheriff Sandoval assembled a small task force of deputies and state investigators to re-examine every shred of evidence. For 6 months, they practically lived in that garage command center, with Jack Parker poring over old case files and interview transcripts. Their persistence paid off in at least reviving one promising lead. A truck driver from Oregon passing through the area around the time the twins vanished had been mentioned in an early tip that was never fully explored. He had a record of violence, a bar fight here, a domestic disturbance there, and a troubling timeline that put him near Silver Creek in late 1996. The task force dug up information that this trucker, a man named Randall Simmons, was suspected in an assault on a woman at a rest stop not long after the Parker girls disappeared. For a moment, it seemed like a tantalizing possibility. Had a roving trucker been the culprit all along? But the hope was short-lived. Simmons had died in 1999, years before, in a long-haul accident in Arizona. With him died any answers he might have held. The task force eventually disbanded, having added a few footnotes to the case file, but no real resolution. As the 2000s progressed, advancements in technology spurred renewed efforts to crack the mystery. In 2004, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was invited to review the case. Using witness statements and crime data, they built a psychological profile of the likely offender. Their conclusion refocused the investigation close to home. This was likely the work of someone who knew the victims, or at least was intimately familiar with the area. The abductor probably lived a normal-looking life in the community, both before and after the crime, a theory that sent a collective shiver through Summit County. It meant that, if correct, the perpetrator might have been smiling alongside everyone at candlelight vigils and chatting with neighbors about the tragedy, all while hiding in plain sight. Without naming names, the profile pointed back to the unsettling possibility that the monster the town feared could have been one of their own all along. In the late 2000s, forensic science had its turn. The Summit County Sheriff's Department, with help from a state grant, undertook a complete review of physical evidence in 2007. Unfortunately, due to the circumstances of the case, there was painfully little evidence to re-examine. Unlike many crimes, here there was no known crime scene, no recovered bodies, no weapon, just remnants of an investigation that had largely been built on witness recollections and intuition. Technicians did their best with what was available. They combed through the old evidence locker and retrieved the few items collected back in 1996, the scrap of blue cloth from the fence, a handful of fibers and hairs vacuumed from Stan Peterson's van, and various personal items from the Parker twins' room for DNA comparison. With modern testing, they confirmed what had long been suspected. The blue cloth had no connection to Amy or Ali, and the hairs from the van were a mixture of animal fur and strands, likely belonging to Peterson's own family. Nothing yielded the kind of definitive DNA link that could crack the case. Moreover, some samples had degraded over time. Poor storage conditions in the 90s meant that a few pieces of potential evidence were now useless. It was another frustrating setback. In 2011, California's Department of Justice established a cold case unit that took an interest in the Parker twins' disappearance. Investigators digitized the case file and fed key details into a national database to look for patterns, maybe similar cases or suspects who might match. They even created a computerized 3D model to simulate how the abduction might have occurred along the girl's route, hoping to identify something investigators had missed. For a brief time, it felt as if technology and fresh eyes might succeed where old-fashioned police work had failed. But once again, no smoking gun emerged. Still, the community and the Parker family refused to let the case slip away completely. Candlelight vigils continued every October 4th. In the age of the internet, online forums and social media groups dedicated to discussing the case sprang up, attracting amateur sleuths from far beyond Summit County. Theories ranged from the plausible, pointing again at known locals, to the outlandish, including cult involvement or secret twin telepathy conspiracies. Amid the speculation, actual leads would occasionally surface. Most led nowhere, but each was a reminder that people still cared, still remembered. In 2014, a surge of excitement and dread rippled through Silver Creek when construction workers breaking ground for a new housing development on the edge of town uncovered skeletal remains. For 2 agonizing days, everyone waited as forensic teams analyzed the bones. Jack and Linda braced themselves, wondering if this was finally the moment they'd get an answer. Even the worst answer would at least end the uncertainty. In the end, it was another heartbreak. The remains were determined to be historical, over a century old, likely belonging to a 19th century prospector from the gold rush era. The Parker twins were still out there somewhere, and the mystery endured. As the 2010s marched on, the story of Amy and Ali Parker drifted into the realm of local legend, especially for those too young to remember the actual events. Around campfires at summer campouts, teenagers would sometimes invoke the ghost twins of River Road, spinning tales that on certain autumn nights you could see 2 young women walking hand in hand down the moonlit road, only to disappear when you got too close. Others swore that if you ventured near the boarded-up old Crescent mine on a quiet evening, you might hear the faint echo of girls crying for help from deep inside. A chilling anecdote that few dared to test. These were the ways a community tried to process the unprocessable, by turning unspeakable tragedy into stories that, while scary, at least had the safety of fiction. But for the Parker family, none of it was fiction. For them, the loss was as real in 2016, 2018, 2020 as it had been in 1996. They lived it every day. Jack, now in his late 60s, had been forced by his own body to slow down after a mild heart attack in 2010, the direct result, doctors said, of long-term stress. He finally retired his volunteer search efforts in the field, though he never stopped analyzing any new tidbit of information that came his way. Linda, health declining, still kept that porch light burning each night and still hung 2 Christmas stockings for the twins on the mantel every December. David, by now married and with children of his own, found himself telling his kids about the 2 aunts they never got to meet, making sure that even in the next generation, Amy and Ali were not forgotten. And Emily, who had been a teenager when her sisters vanished and was now nearly the age her mother had been back then, continued to be the steadfast anchor. She organized a Keep Hope Alive charity 5K run each year on the anniversary of the disappearance, raising funds for non-profit groups that assist families of missing persons. She spoke at conferences about the unique torment of ambiguous loss, turning her family's suffering into advocacy. Through every scorching California summer, every crisp autumn, each one bringing back memories of that fateful October, every rainy winter and blooming spring, the Parkers held onto a glimmer of hope. They lived in a purgatory of not knowing, a reality shared by thousands of families of missing people. And yet they persisted. They celebrated the twins' birthdays every year with a cake, chocolate their favorite, and never lost hope that someday, somehow, they would get answers. They could not have imagined that the breakthrough was finally on the horizon. Nearly 25 years after Amy and Ali walked down River Road and disappeared, the truth was about to surface from the unlikeliest of places. All it would take was an adventurous group of teenagers, an old mine and a young deputy, willing to dig a little deeper. On a cool afternoon in mid-September 2021, nearly 25 years after Amy and Ali Parker vanished, a group of 5 local teenagers ventured into the overgrown site of the old Crescent mine on a dare. The mine, once part of Summit Mining Company's operations, had been abandoned and fenced off for years, its entrance secured with concrete slabs and warnings of unstable tunnels. But as teenagers often do, they found a way in, squeezing through a gap where one of the slabs had cracked. They filmed themselves exploring the first 100 feet of the tunnel for social media, their laughter echoing in the darkness, until a sudden flurry of bats sent them scrambling in fear. In their hasty retreat, they thought they saw something that gave them pause. What looked like a pile of stones and wood forming a wall in a side passage, almost as if intentionally placed. Spooked and curious, one of them mentioned it later that evening to an older brother, who happened to work at the sheriff's department. By the next morning, Deputy Jake Sorensen had heard the tale and decided to head out to Crescent Mine to ensure no one else got any bright ideas about urban spelunking in an unsafe mine. Deputy Sorensen didn't expect to find much that day aside from some graffiti and litter. When he arrived at the site, the pine trees were whispering in an autumn breeze and the late afternoon sun slanted against the boarded-up entrance. Inside, the mine was chilly and silent. Armed with only a flashlight and a healthy dose of caution, Sorensen advanced slowly, mindful of the uneven ground and the musty air. About 80 yards in, his flashlight illuminated something curious. Along one wall of the main tunnel, a narrower side passage had been deliberately blocked off. A haphazard barricade of rocks, old timbers and dirt was stacked about chest-high across the mouth of the smaller tunnel. It didn't look like the aftermath of a natural cave-in. It looked constructed. A sense of unease prickled through the deputy. He radioed the dispatcher, requesting backup and noting his location deep inside the mine. Carefully, he began to remove some of the loose rocks and planks. As he made a gap large enough to peer through, the beam of his flashlight caught a glimpse of something pale in the darkness beyond. At first, he thought they were just oddly shaped rocks, but as he aimed the light and his eyes adjusted, he realized with a jolt what he was seeing. Bones. Human remains. Sorensen's stomach lurched, but he steadied himself and expanded the opening. Squeezing through the partially dismantled barrier, he entered a small alcove that had been carved out decades before as a test shaft. There on the ground lay 2 sets of human skeletal remains side by side. The bones were coated in a fine layer of dust, and here and there small tatters of faded blue fabric clung to the skeletons, fabric that looked an awful lot like the old uniforms from Hal's diner. A few scattered objects were on the ground nearby, dulled by time. Deputy Sorensen's shaking light caught the glint of one such object, and as he knelt down, he felt his heart skip. It was a silver locket, its once shiny surface tarnished black, but the engraving on it was still visible. AP. Within hours, the abandoned Crescent mine was transformed into a major crime scene. Sheriff's vehicles and FBI SUVs parked haphazardly on the old access road, their flashing lights painting the trees red and blue in the twilight. News traveled fast through Silver Creek. By nightfall, a crowd of onlookers had gathered behind the police tape that now cordoned off the site, the air thick with a mix of reverence and morbid curiosity. Many suspected immediately what the authorities would soon confirm. The decades-long search for Amy and Ali Parker had finally come to an end. Forensic teams worked methodically over the next several days, treating the mine alcove like an archaeological dig. The remains were not disturbed until every detail was documented and scanned. Crime scene photographers captured the poignant scene. Two skeletons lying parallel, their arms nearly touching, as if they had been placed or arranged with a semblance of care. The remnants of their diner uniforms, scraps of blue poly-cotton blend, still clung to the bones, leaving no doubt these individuals had been brought to the mine directly after their disappearance, without ever changing clothes. Investigators even recovered the rusty remains of a pair of cheap wristwatches, which Jack identified as belonging to his daughters. And, of course, there was the locket engraved with AP, a gift Amy had received on her 16th birthday and seldom removed. It was found right beside one of the skeletons, as though lovingly set there. Dental records and DNA testing would later conclusively verify what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains were indeed those of Amy and Allison Parker. The sisters had been found at last. But along with that discovery came a host of new questions. How had they ended up in this sealed-off tunnel? Who had put them there, and why had it taken so long to find? The answers, long hidden in the cold darkness, were now within reach. The county coroner, aided by forensic anthropologists from Sacramento State University, carefully examined the skeletal remains for clues to how the twins died. Despite a quarter-century in a damp cave, the bones were in relatively good condition, protected by the mine's stable temperatures and the makeshift wall that had kept out scavengers. On each skull, the experts noted nearly identical depressed fractures on the back left side, wounds consistent with blows from a heavy, blunt object. The pattern and location suggested the sisters likely never saw the attack coming. They were struck from behind, possibly even simultaneously, or one after the other in quick succession. These injuries were deemed the probable cause of death, matching what investigators long suspected. The twins had likely been assaulted and killed on the very night they disappeared. Other marks on the bones were minimal, no evidence of gunshot wounds or knife trauma, and no indication that they'd been bound. No ropes or restraints were found in the alcove, and the wrist bones showed no telltale marks. It appeared the killer's weapon of choice had been something like a heavy tool or blunt instrument, and that death came swiftly. Perhaps one of the most unsettling details was the way Amy and Ali's remains were positioned. Rather than being dumped carelessly, the two were laid out next to each other, their heads almost touching and arms at their sides. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Karen Lynn noted, "It was almost respectful, as if someone placed them there deliberately, with a degree of care instead of just tossing them in. In homicide cases, that can be a sign the perpetrator felt some remorse or had a personal connection to the victims." It was a chilling thought. Their killer might have known them well, even cared about them in some twisted way, and had gone to the trouble of arranging their bodies, perhaps even saying a private goodbye in the dark silence of the mine. The evidence extracted from the mine began to paint a vivid picture. Soil samples from around the remains contained tiny flecks of rust and oil. When analyzed, these turned out to match a specific type of industrial lubricant that had been used exclusively by the Summit Mining Company in the 1990s to maintain their drilling equipment. It was a distinctive chemical signature, one not likely found outside the mining context. This was a crucial clue. Whoever hid the bodies here had access to that lubricant, likely on their clothing or tools, and by extension, likely had ties to the mine itself. Additionally, fibers found within the debris of the walled-up entrance caught investigators' interest. Intermixed with the dirt used to seal the alcove were bits of fibrous material that forensic analysts determined were burlap and canvas fibers. Summit Mining's records showed that back in the mid-90s, heavy canvas tarps and burlap sacks were commonly used by maintenance crews for hauling rocks and patching leaks. The presence of those fibers suggested that the person who created the barrier might have used company materials, or even done the work during company time. All these clues, The particular way the wall was built, the lubricant, the fibers, pointed to someone intimately familiar with Crescent Mine's operations and layout. Investigators pored over old company blueprints and reports. They discovered that the narrow side tunnel where the remains were found had been part of a mining expansion project that was abandoned and sealed off in late 1995 due to a cave-in making it unsafe. That detail explained why searchers in 1996 hadn't gone into that tunnel. On official maps, it was marked as impassable, a dead zone within the mine. Only someone with detailed knowledge of the mine at that time would think to use it as a hiding place, knowing it wouldn't be searched. Within a week of the discovery, a task force of local, state, and federal investigators assembled to piece together everything. At the Summit County Sheriff's Office, dusty boxes of the original case file were brought out and re-examined through the new lens of evidence. The detectives were looking for a name, the person who had been right there all along, and soon they found it. Cross-referencing employee logs from Summit Mining in 1995-1996 with the list of individuals interviewed in the original investigation yielded one name that practically leapt off the page. It was someone who had indeed been spoken to in passing back in 1996 because he worked with Jack Parker, and someone who had the keys, literally and figuratively, to the mine. Leonard Mitchell, age 45 at the time of the disappearance, had been the maintenance supervisor at Crescent Mine. In that role, he would have known every inch of the tunnels, including the sealed side shaft. He also would have had access to the lubricant and other materials identified by the forensics team. Back in 1996, Leonard Mitchell's interview notes were brief. He told deputies he was home with his wife on the night of October 4th, and nothing about him had stood out amid the flurry of early leads. After all, dozens of mine employees had been questioned as a routine matter, and Mitchell had no obvious connection to the twins outside of knowing their father from work. There were no hints of suspicion attached to his name in the old files. But now, in 2021, that same name came loaded with new context and a gut feeling among the investigators. This was the person they'd been hunting for a quarter of a century. With the forensic evidence from the mine pointing squarely at Leonard Mitchell, investigators dug into his history, assembling a portrait of a man who had managed to avoid scrutiny for decades. Mitchell, 70 years old in 2021, had lived in Silver Creek since 1992, when Summit Mining recruited him from out of state. What no one in the hiring process knew, and what local authorities hadn't realized in 1996, was that Leonard Mitchell had left behind a troubling past in the places he lived before. Modern database searches that were unavailable in the 90s uncovered that Mitchell had been questioned, though never charged, in the disappearance of a young woman near Reno, Nevada, in 1989. The woman, a 19-year-old store clerk, had rejected a customer's persistent advances shortly before she went missing. That customer was later identified as Leonard Mitchell, but with no evidence, the case went cold. 2 years later, in 1991, Mitchell was arrested in Oregon for assaulting a female co-worker who rebuffed him, but the charges were dropped when the terrified victim decided not to testify. These red flags hadn't followed Mitchell to California. Back then, records weren't as interconnected, and a clean-looking resume and a polite demeanor were enough for him to land the maintenance supervisor job at Summit Mining. In Silver Creek, Leonard Mitchell kept a low profile at first. He was known to be handy, and was often called upon to fix equipment at the mine that others couldn't. Jack Parker had worked under him on some projects and considered him competent, if a bit standoffish. Outside of work, Mitchell slowly eased into the fabric of the community. He and his wife Carol bought a modest ranch-style house on Maple Lane, Bitterly, just 6 blocks from the Parker home. They had no children. Carol was a quiet woman who occasionally attended church and volunteered at the library, often seen with a scarf around her neck and downcast eyes. To neighbors, the Mitchells seemed like a perfectly ordinary, if somewhat private, middle-aged couple. But there were small disconcerting hints of Leonard's darker interests that only came to light with hindsight. A few former employees of Hal's Diner, re-interviewed in 2021, recalled Leonard Mitchell as a regular customer back in the mid-90s. He usually came in alone, sat at the counter, and by all accounts nursed his coffee while making chit-chat with the staff. Marjorie Keene, the diner manager, remembered that he often chose to sit in whatever section Amy Parker was serving. "I used to tease Amy that she had a secret admirer," Marjorie recounted somberly. "He was always very polite, nothing overt. But looking back, he definitely paid her a lot of attention." Another waitress recalled Leonard attempting to give Amy a small gift once, a potted violet plant, which Amy had politely declined, saying it was sweet, but she couldn't accept it. At the time, no one thought much of it. Silver Creek was the kind of town where customers and waitresses knew each other by name. Leonard was just another local who tipped decently and talked about weather and sports. Now, of course, those benign interactions took on a far more sinister cast. As investigators built their case in 2021, one of the most damning pieces of the puzzle came from within Leonard's own home. Armed with a search warrant, police carefully searched the Mitchell house. Tucked away in the attic, in a dusty old army surplus footlocker, they found a collection of personal papers that had belonged to Leonard's late wife, Carol. Carol had died of cancer in 2009, and it seemed Leonard had stowed away her belongings, untouched. In that footlocker, among old photographs and keepsakes, was a leather-bound diary. What Carol Mitchell had written in those pages would break the case wide open and break the hearts of those who read it. Carol's diary entries from October 1996 were chilling. On October 5th, 1996, the day after the Parker twins went missing, she wrote, "Lenny came home late last night, long after midnight. He was covered in dirt and mud. I was so scared to ask him anything. This morning the news is talking about those two missing girls. I have a terrible, terrible feeling." A few days later, an entry read, "The police came by to ask about that night. I told them Len was with me watching TV. I lied for him. I can't sleep." In subsequent entries spanning years, Carol alluded to living in fear of Leonard's temper and hinted that she knew more about the Parker case than anyone realized. "Not a day goes by I don't think of those poor Parker girls, and my part in letting things be. God forgive me." Perhaps most heartbreaking was a passage written in 2001, shortly after Carol's cancer diagnosis. "I carry the weight of my silence. I think he did it. I'm too afraid to ever say it out loud, but I know. If I ever find the courage, I will tell someone, but I fear it's already too late for me." Carol never did get to tell her story to the authorities, but in death, through her written words, she finally spoke. Her diary effectively placed Leonard outside the home the night of the crime and showed that his alibi had been a lie coerced by threats. Investigators didn't stop there. They pursued the trail of Leonard's old green 1986 Ford station wagon, the car he had owned in 1996. Mitchell had sold the vehicle in 1997, a few months after the twins disappeared, claiming he wanted something with better gas mileage. Through DMV records and a bit of luck, authorities tracked the station wagon to a scrapyard outside Medford, Oregon. In a painstaking examination, forensic specialists combed through the dusty, gutted interior of the vehicle. Deep under the back seat, wedged in a crevice of the seat frame, they found what would become the final nail in the coffin for Leonard Mitchell, a tiny patch of dried reddish-brown stain. Chemical tests confirmed it was human blood. And when the DNA results came back, it was a match to both Amy and Allison Parker. Even after decades, science had spoken. The Parker twins had been in that car. The growing mountain of evidence painted a horrific but clear picture. Leonard Mitchell had likely offered the girls a ride, or otherwise enticed them into his station wagon on that fateful night, perhaps under the pretense of a friendly gesture from a familiar face. One theory posited by detectives was that he might have pulled up alongside them on River Road, offering a lift home since it was getting late. Trusting a face they knew from the diner, and as their dad's co-worker, the twins might have accepted. Tragically, that trust was betrayed. Once they were in his car, he had taken them by surprise and struck them, perhaps even before they realized what was happening. He then used his knowledge of the mine to hide their bodies in a location he was certain no one would check, a side tunnel scheduled to be sealed the very next day as part of the mine's maintenance plan. In fact, Summit Mining records showed that on October 5th, 1996, Leonard's maintenance crew, under his direction, had indeed finished sealing that tunnel, conveniently entombing the terrible secret without anyone else realizing it was more than a routine safety task. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Leonard Mitchell's story was how normal he appeared, and for how long. After 1996, as suspicion gradually drifted away from the Parker case, Leonard continued living his life in Summit County as if nothing had happened. When the mine shut down in 2003, he took a job as a maintenance supervisor for the Silver Creek School District, fixing leaky faucets and replacing light bulbs at the very high school Amy and Allie had attended. He held that job until he retired in 2015. Neighbors described him as reliable, if somewhat aloof. He mowed his lawn every Saturday at 8 a.m. sharp, waved politely at anyone who greeted him, and kept to himself otherwise. He attended church with casual regularity, helped out at annual town picnics flipping burgers, and even volunteered a few times at the local food bank. When the community organized searches or vigils for the Parker twins, Leonard was there too, blending into the crowd. In a photo from the 10-year candlelight vigil in 2006, a grainy image shows Leonard Mitchell among the attendees in the background, holding a candle with a solemn expression. At the time, no one thought twice about the quiet man paying his respects to the lost girls. Some of Leonard's former co-workers from the school district were stunned and sickened when they learned of his arrest. One teacher recalled how Leonard would sometimes bring up the Parker case during lunch breaks if the subject of local history came up. He said something I'll never forget, the teacher, Anne Truong, told reporters. We were talking about unsolved mysteries, and Leonard just shook his head and said, "Those Parker girls, and they'll never be found, not where folks are looking." I thought he was just being pessimistic or folksy. Now I realize he was gloating in plain sight. By late October 2021, law enforcement had compiled an airtight case. They had forensic evidence, written confessions of a sort from Carol's diary, and a web of circumstantial evidence that all pointed to one man. It was time to make an arrest and finally unmask the killer who had lived among them for so long. Just before dawn on October 28, 2021, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles converged on Maple Lane. Neighbors peering from behind curtains watched in bewilderment as officers in tactical gear quietly surrounded Leonard Mitchell's small ranch house. At 6 a.m. sharp, using a bullhorn, the lead officer called out for the occupant to come outside with his hands up. Lights flicked on in the windows. Moments later, the front door creaked open and Leonard Mitchell shuffled out onto his porch. He was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, his grey hair uncombed, looking every bit the part of a just-woken elderly man, not the monster the community now knew him to be. He offered no resistance as deputies secured his wrists in handcuffs and guided him to an unmarked sedan. "What's this about?" a stunned neighbor heard him ask, as if he truly didn't know. By sunrise, word had spread. The man responsible for the Parker twins' disappearance, the man who had been living among them for 25 years, had finally been arrested. The news hit Silver Creek like a shockwave. In a town of only a few thousand people, everyone either knew Leonard Mitchell or knew of him. That quiet fellow who fixed the school's heating system, who sat in the third pew at church, who bagged groceries at the food bank every Thanksgiving, he was now accused of the most heinous crime in the town's memory. Many residents reacted with disbelief and anger. How could it be true? How could they have been so deceived? Strangers approached the Parker family in tears, apologizing for ever having politely chatted with the man at community events. Parents found themselves re-evaluating every lesson they'd ever taught their children about stranger danger, realizing that the boogeyman can wear the face of a kindly neighbor. Later that day, at a press conference on the courthouse steps, Summit County Sheriff James Whitaker addressed a throng of reporters and anxious locals. Flanked by FBI agents and the district attorney, he announced the charges in a steady voice. Leonard Cyrus Mitchell, age 70, of Silver Creek, was in custody and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Amy and Allison Parker. Gasps rippled through the crowd, despite everyone already suspecting what would be said. The sheriff outlined the basics of the case, the discovery of the remains, the forensic evidence, the reopened investigation, careful not to divulge too many graphic details. When asked whether Mitchell had confessed or made any statement, the sheriff shook his head. "Mr. Mitchell has thus far declined to speak to investigators. We will let the evidence speak for itself in court." For the Parker family, The arrest was a complex mixture of relief and grief. Emily Parker and her brother David stood with their mother Linda behind the wall of microphones at the press conference, while Jack Parker sat in the front row, oxygen tank in tow and a determined look in his eyes. It was important to Jack to see the man accused of murdering his daughters, and he had insisted on being present, despite his frail health. When deputies led Leonard Mitchell from the jail into the courthouse for his arraignment, Jack locked eyes with him. Leonard, now dressed in an orange jumpsuit, largely kept his gaze downcast, but for a brief second he glanced at Jack. Observers said the hatred and sorrow in the bereaved father's face was palpable. Leonard quickly looked away. Linda Parker chose not to attend the hearing. She couldn't bear to be in the same room as the devil who stole my girls, as she later said. Instead, she waited at home, clutching a rosary and praying that justice would prevail. Emily Parker, now 39, stepped forward to speak on behalf of her family at the press conference. Her voice wavered with emotion, but was resolute. "We are relieved that after so many years, the person responsible for this has been identified and arrested," she said. "We're grateful to the law enforcement officers who never gave up, and to every person who kept my sisters in their hearts." She glanced back at her father, then at the cameras. "But today is not a happy day for us. There is no arrest, no conviction, no punishment that can restore what was taken from us. We lost Amy and Ali 25 years ago. We've lived in pain every day since. Knowing who did it and seeing him face justice, it matters, but it doesn't bring them back." David, standing beside her, placed a hand on her back as she continued, voice steely now. "I hope Mr. Mitchell can comprehend what he's done, not just to our family, but to this community he deceived. And I hope he spends every remaining day of his life remembering the faces of Amy and Ali and what he took from all of us." The community's reaction in the aftermath of the arrest was immediate and visceral. There was immense relief. Parents no longer had to fret that an unknown kidnapper was lurking in their midst, but that relief was tempered by a sense of collective guilt and soul-searching. Town hall meetings were organized in the weeks that followed, ostensibly to update the public on the legal case, but they often turned into forums for neighbors to vent their disbelief and regret. "We all feel like we failed the Parker family," said Margaret Holmes, who had helped coordinate search parties back in 1996. "All these years we were looking outside when the answer was right here in town." Another resident stood up and openly apologized to the Parkers for the community's earlier suspicions of innocent people. In the early days of the investigation, suspicion had fallen on various individuals. Some locals still remembered whispering about the Parker cousin, or the mine owner, or that troubled ex-boyfriend. Now those suspicions felt like injustices in their own right. In a quiet, extraordinary gesture, townspeople created a makeshift memorial, not at the site of the crime, but on the sidewalk outside Leonard Mitchell's house. It began with someone leaving a bouquet of white lilies and a note that read, "For Amy and Ali. We're sorry it took so long." Others added to it, framed photographs of the twins, candles that burned each night, stuffed animals, and handwritten letters expressing sorrow and outrage. It was as if the community wanted to physically reclaim that space, to purge the evil that had resided behind those walls by filling the street with love and remembrance for the victims. Among the most striking aspects of the arrest was the realization of how convincingly normal Mitchell had appeared. Dr. Elaine Chen, a criminal psychologist interviewed on a local news segment, summed it up. "What makes this so frightening is the banality of it. We want to believe that we could spot a killer, that there's something obviously off about them. But the truth is, the most dangerous predators are often the ones who go unnoticed. They hide in plain sight by conforming to expectations, by being helpful, polite, unremarkable. Mitchell was a master at that. Indeed, for a quarter-century, Leonard Mitchell had moved about freely in a community traumatized by a crime he perpetrated, feigning empathy and sharing in the grief that he himself had caused. As the legal proceedings began, many braced for a protracted battle in court. Would Leonard Mitchell plead guilty or not? Would there be a lengthy trial, dredging up all the gruesome details? For the Parkers and the town, the prospect of hearing exactly what happened on October 4, 1996, was both terrifying and oddly welcome. They needed answers, but some answers would inevitably reopen old wounds. One thing was certain. Silver Creek was united in a way it hadn't been in decades. They were determined to see justice done for Amy and Ali and to support the Parker family through the difficult road still ahead. The feeling in the air was that of a long-held breath finally being released, a mix of relief, sorrow, anger, and a resolve to never let such a thing fester in silence again. Leonard Mitchell's trial began in March 2022, a date that by eerie coincidence fell just a week before what would have been Amy and Ali's 44th birthdays. The proceedings took place in the Summit County Courthouse, the same courthouse the twins used to walk past on their way home from the diner. Security was tight. Even though Mitchell was a frail-looking 70-year-old, the nature of his crimes put everyone on edge. Interest in the case was intense, not just locally but nationally, as people followed yet another decades-old cold case finally coming to closure. Due to ongoing pandemic precautions, the courtroom gallery was limited in capacity. But that hardly mattered. A rotation of Parker family supporters and lifelong Silver Creek residents ensured that every seat was filled each day, with many more watching a closed-circuit feed from an overflow room. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Leonard Mitchell pleaded not guilty. Those who hoped he might at last express remorse or explain himself were disappointed. He maintained a stoic, almost vacant expression throughout most of the trial, speaking only in hushed tones to his attorney and otherwise staring straight ahead. In contrast, the prosecution laid out a devastatingly clear narrative of his guilt. Over the course of a week, jurors were presented with the painstaking work of a quarter-century investigation: the DNA matches from the mine and the car, the mining company records, the photographs of the makeshift tomb, the poignant testimony of forensic experts about how the twins likely died, and excerpts from Carol Mitchell's diary read aloud in a quiet courtroom that hung on every word. Former co-workers of Leonard's took the stand to recount his familiarity with the mine layout and his peculiar statements over the years. Emily Parker testified as well, delivering a powerful account of what her family endured and directly addressing the man who caused it, saying, "You lived your life free for 25 years, Mr. Mitchell, while my sisters lost theirs and we lost our peace. I hope you understand that we will never forgive what you've done." Mitchell's defense attorney, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, mounted only a token case in return. There was little to challenge in the prosecution's evidence. Instead, the defense focused on Mitchell's age and health, arguing that prison would be unnecessarily cruel for a 70-year-old man. It was a strategy unlikely to sway any juror, not in the face of such brutality and betrayal of trust. After closing arguments, the jury retreated to deliberate. They returned with a verdict in an astonishingly short time, just under 3 hours. On April 2, 2022, the court clerk read out the words that the Parker family and the town of Silver Creek had been awaiting for so long: guilty on all counts. Leonard Mitchell was convicted of the murders of Amy and Allison Parker, as well as their kidnappings and associated charges. During sentencing, Leonard was given one last opportunity to speak. A heavy silence fell as everyone waited to see if he would finally shed his mask and apologize or explain. He slowly rose, gripping the edges of the defense table with his cuffed hands for support. For a moment, it looked as if he might say something, but then he simply shook his head and muttered, "No, Your Honor." Aside from that, he offered nothing. No apology, no denial, no explanation. It was in keeping with the man he had been whenever anyone tried to truly know him, ultimately unknowable. Judge Samuel Alvarez then addressed the court. "No sentence I impose today can undo the terrible harm done on that October night in 1996, he began. He acknowledged the Parker family's immense loss and the community's prolonged anguish. In a poignant gesture, the judge held up a photograph of Amy and Ali that had been entered as evidence, the same smiling senior portrait that had been on the missing posters, and placed it where Leonard could see it. These two young women were full of life and potential. You stole that from them, Mr. Mitchell, and you stole it from their family and community. Justice may have been delayed, but it will not be denied." Judge Alvarez sentenced Leonard Mitchell to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, one for Amy, one for Ali. In California, that effectively meant Mitchell would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. The consecutive nature of the sentences was largely symbolic, acknowledging the separate value of each young life he had taken. As the judge pronounced the sentence, many in the courtroom wept quietly, a mix of sorrow for what was lost and relief that accountability, however late, had finally arrived. Jack Parker, who had insisted on attending every day of the trial despite his doctor's concerns, let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 25 years. Linda Parker closed her eyes and gripped Emily's hand tightly. There was no joy in that moment, but there was a measure of peace. Outside, gathered on the courthouse lawn, a crowd of townspeople huddled around portable radios, and live streams erupted in a solemn applause as word of the verdict and sentence filtered out. They weren't celebrating Leonard Mitchell's fate so much as acknowledging the end of a long, painful chapter. In the days that followed, Leonard Mitchell was transferred to a state penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. There, the man who had once roamed free among his unsuspecting neighbors became just another inmate with a number, living out his final years in the confines of a prison cell. He remained largely silent and impassive, even behind bars, reportedly never admitting his guilt or expressing remorse to the prison chaplain or officials. It seemed he would carry his secrets with him to the grave, leaving the world to speculate about the why of it all. But at least, as many observed, he would do so in a place where he could never hurt anyone again. For the Parker family and the community of Silver Creek, the conviction brought the closest thing to justice they could hope for. It did not restore the lives that were taken. It did not magically heal the wounds in their hearts. But it affirmed that despite the passage of time, what was done in darkness had finally been brought to light. In the wake of the trial, life in Summit County slowly began to move forward, though it would never be quite the same. With the mystery solved, there was an overwhelming sense of relief, but also a recognition of the immense cost of that resolution. The Parker family, after enduring a quarter-century of limbo, faced the new challenge of grieving with finality. Jack Parker, having seen the conviction of the man who took his daughters, seemed to find a measure of peace that had eluded him for decades. "I can go to Amy and Allie now and tell them justice was served," he told a friend, referring to his daily visits to the cemetery, where 2 empty gravestones had borne the twins' names since the early 2000s. Indeed, just 2 months after the trial, Jack passed away quietly in his sleep. At 68, his body had been worn down by years of stress and heartache. "It's as if he held on just long enough," Emily said at his funeral, "to fulfill his promise to them." Jack was laid to rest with a photo of Amy and Allie tucked into his suit pocket and the twins' recovered locket clasped in his hands. Linda Parker, though frail, showed a resilience that amazed those around her. For the first time in 25 years, she allowed herself to do what she had promised she never would until her daughters were found. She packed up Amy and Allie's bedroom. On a warm summer morning, with sunlight streaming through the window, Linda carefully folded the dresses that had hung untouched in the closet since 1996. She gently packed away the knickknacks on the dresser, Allie's collection of music boxes, Amy's neatly lined up paperback novels. Many items she chose to donate to a local women's shelter, believing her girls would have wanted to help others. But a few precious keepsakes, the guitar Allie strummed at church, Amy's favorite childhood doll, Linda kept, to hold on to as she navigated the uncertain terrain of life after hope and fear. "They are at peace now," she said softly as she finally closed the bedroom door. For Linda, knowing the truth, however painful, allowed her to swap the nightly vigil by the window for quiet visits to her daughter's grave, where she could speak to them and pray without the gnawing question of where hanging over every prayer. David and Emily Parker channeled their complex emotions into ensuring that their sister's legacy would endure. In early 2023, they established the Parker Twins Memorial Fund, a charity aimed at supporting investigations into cold cases and helping families of missing persons in California. "We can't change what happened to us," David explained at the fund's launch event, "but maybe we can help prevent other families from waiting decades for answers." The fund provides grants to police departments for advanced DNA testing and specialized training for rural law enforcement agencies, ensuring that other families might find answers sooner than theirs did. Emily, who remained in Silver Creek, also spearheaded a scholarship program at Silver Creek High School in Amy and Ali's memory. Each year, it awards a scholarship to a graduating senior who plans to study criminal justice or forensic science, a way of encouraging the next generation to carry on the work of solving the unsolved. If even one case can be cracked a little sooner, one family spared what we went through, Emily said, then Amy and Ali's memory truly becomes a blessing. Law enforcement agencies took lessons from the Parker case to heart. The California Department of Justice incorporated a case study of the investigation into training materials for cold case units, highlighting both the investigative failures of 1996, such as overlooked leads and biases, and the dogged persistence that eventually brought resolution. The FBI uses the case in seminars on how modern forensic technology, like advanced DNA analysis and digital databases, can breathe new life into old evidence. It's also cited as a cautionary tale about not dismissing ordinary suspects. Detectives are reminded to dig deeper into alibis and consider that those who appear helpful or benign might hide dark secrets, as the Parker case so painfully demonstrated. In Summit County, grassroots changes took place too. A group of residents formed a volunteer community safety coalition that works with local law enforcement to keep an eye on missing persons cases and unsolved crimes in the area. They host annual workshops on neighborhood vigilance and support networks for families in crisis, hoping to foster a sense of collective responsibility. At Silver Creek High School, a new unit in the social studies curriculum examines the Parker case and its impact, teaching students about empathy, community action, and the importance of speaking up if something seems amiss. As for Leonard Mitchell, he did not live long beyond his conviction. In the winter of 2023, less than 2 years into his life sentences, Leonard died in state prison from natural causes. He passed with the same silence he had kept since his arrest, never once offering any further explanation or apology for his actions. In some ways, it was anticlimactic. There was no jailhouse confession, no dramatic final words. He took whatever private motivations or justifications he harbored with him to the grave. Some wondered if he felt any remorse at the end, but in truth, it no longer mattered. With Leonard Mitchell gone, the final specter of the Parker twins case was laid to rest. In April 2024, on what would have marked Amy and Ali's 46th birthday, the town of Silver Creek held a memorial service celebrating their lives. It wasn't a funeral, that had long since passed, but rather a tribute. Friends, family, and townspeople gathered in the refurbished town square. They released 46 white balloons into a clear blue sky, 23 for each sister, one for every year of life they never got to experience. Photographs of the twins at different ages were displayed. 2 little girls with gap-toothed grins on their first day of school, 2 confident teens in diner uniforms, 2 young women whose bright futures were forever out of reach. The high school choir, in which Ali once sang, performed a gentle rendition of Amazing Grace, and many in the crowd silently mouthed the lyrics through tears. Silver Creek will never forget Amy and Allison Parker. Their story, though born of tragedy, became a beacon highlighting the importance of perseverance, community support, and the relentless pursuit of truth. As one resident put it during the memorial, "Those girls brought out the best in this town, eventually. They reminded us that we have to look out for each other and that we should never ever give up on finding the truth." The Parker case stands as a testament to the idea that justice delayed is still justice, and that no matter how much time passes, the voices of the lost continue to call out for answers. In this case, those voices were finally heard. This case proves that even after 25 years, justice is never out of reach. If you found this story impactful, please subscribe to Cold Case Desk and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future deep dives into cases like this. Your support helps keep these important stories alive, ensuring that victims are never forgotten and that pressure remains to solve the unsolved. Share this video with anyone who appreciates that persistence can pay off in the end. What cold case do you think deserves more attention next? Comment below. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers. And as the Parker family's journey shows, as long as we remember and persevere, there's always hope that the truth will come to light. Justice delayed in the end was not justice denied.